Moving on to our third song. This will be our final song before we start the Megillah reading festivities. And this one also has actions. It's a little bit easier. So Hamantashen, when we sing Hamantashen, we're going to make the triangle the shape of the Hamantashen. When we sing Esther, we're going to be mighty. When we sing He Whose Name Shall Not Be Mentioned Until We're Ready, we're going to give a thumbs down. And when we sing Mordechai, we're going to give a thumbs up. All right? I'm just going to do what I did last time and start singing it. The melody does not change. Hamantashen, 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 Hamantashen. This is our Purim song. If you want to sing along, Hamantashen, Esther, Haman, Mordechai. There you go. Here we go. Who's the hero of our story? Esther, Esther. Who's the hero of our story? This is our Purim song. If you want to sing along, Hamantashen, Esther, Haman, Mordechai. Who's the villain of our story? Haman, boo. Who's the villain of our story? Haman, boo. This is our Purim song. If you want to sing along, Hamantashen, Esther, Haman, Mordechai. Who helped Esther be a hero? Mordechai, yay! Who helped Esther be a hero? Mordechai, yay! This is our Purim song. If you want to sing along, Hamantashen, Esther, Haman, Mordechai. What's the treat we love to eat at Purim? Hamantashen. What's the treat we love to eat at Purim? Hamantashen. This is our Purim song. If you want to sing, Hamantashen, Esther, Haman, Mordechai. Hamantashen, 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 Hamantashen. This is our Purim song. If you want to sing along, Hamantashen, Esther, Haman, Mordechai. Oh, thank you, band, for being way more together than I was. I appreciate that. All right, welcome everyone to our 2023 Purim Megillah reading. I appreciate to have you all here. I want to thank all of our readers that you're about to hear from and all of our musicians who have showed up just singing music that I threw at them about 2 seconds ago, playing music, whatever. Our readers are going to come up here. Now, we have a treat tonight. And that is my friend Michelle Cox is going to chant the actual melody of the blessings for you. We don't get to hear that a lot. And also she will come up and chant the very last chapter so that you can hear. For those of you who know what trope is, right? Trope is the melody that we sing the Torah to. This particular Megillah has its own trope that's not like anything else. So we get a chance to hear that, and I'm very excited for that. Before we start, I want to go over some rules of the game. Does everybody have their groggers? Excellent, excellent. So just a reminder, anytime you hear the name of Haman, you don't even need, okay? Do you know what you do when you hear Mordechai? Excellent. And then we've added a new one because I didn't like any of the ones that we used to do for Esther. So what are we going to do for Esther? Yes, Queen. Yes, very good. All right, Michelle, when you are ready, we will start with the blessings. And Elizabeth Lenz, you are on deck.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al hamikra Megillah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim lavoteinu bayamim ha'im bazman hazeh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu
Michelle. Our first reader, chapter 1, Elizabeth Lenz.
It happened in the days of Ahasuerus that Ahasuerus, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administration of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors of the provinces in his service. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. At the end of this period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all the people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. There were hangings of white cotton and blue wool caught up by cords of fine linen, and purple wool to silver rods and alabaster columns. And there were couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble, alabaster, mother of pearl, and mosaics. Royal wine was served in abundance, as befits a king, in golden beakers, beakers of varied design. And the rule for the drinking was no restrictions. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. In addition, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bizetha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abaktha, Zathar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs in attendance on King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal diadem, to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. The king was greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him. Then the king consulted the sages learned in procedure, for it was the royal practice to turn to all who were versed in law and precedent. His closest advisors were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the royal presence and occupied the first place in the kingdom. What, he asked, shall be done according to law to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs? Thereupon Memucan declared in the presence of the king and the ministers, Queen Vashti has committed an offense, not only against your majesty, but also against all the officials and all the peoples in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands. As they reflect that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will cite it to all your majesty's officials, and there will be no end of scorn and provocation. If it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be abrogated, that Vashti shall never enter the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let your majesty bestow her royal state upon another who is more worthy than she. Then will the judgment executed by your majesty resound throughout your realm, vast though it is, and all wives will treat their husbands with respect, high and low alike. The proposal was approved by the king and the ministers, and the king did as Memucan proposed. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, and to every nation in its own language, that every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people.
That seems fair. Chapter 2, please lend your ear to Marcia Ridmaster.
Sometime afterward, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young women be sought out for his majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young women at the fortress in Shushan, in the harem under the supervision of Hegai, the king's eunuch, guardian of women. Let them be provided with their cosmetics And let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti. The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordecai. Yay! The son of Yair, the son of Shemuel, and son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Jeconiah of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He was foster father to Hadassah, that is, Esther. Yay, Esther! His uncle's daughter. For she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order and edict was proclaimed, and when many girls were assembled in the fortress in Shushan under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the supervision of Haggai, guardian of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he hastened to furnish her with her cosmetics and rations, food, as well as with the 7 maids who were her due from the king's palace. And he treated her and her maids with special kindness in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. Every single day, Mordecai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what happened to her. When each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus at the end of 12 months treatment prescribed for women, that was the period spent on beautifying them, 12 months. 6 months of oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and more cosmetics. And it was after that that the girl would go to the king, when whatever she asked for would be given to her, and she would be taken from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning. You can figure that out. For a second harem in charge of Shagas, the king's eunuch, guardian of the concubines. She would not go again to the king unless the king wanted her, when she would be summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she did not ask for anything but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women, advised. Yet Esther, she won the admiration of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the other young women. So he set a royal diadem on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a great banquet for all his officials and courtiers, the banquet of Esther. He proclaimed a remission of taxes for all the provinces and distributed gifts as benefits a king. When the young women were assembled a second time, Mordecai sat in the palace gate. But Esther still did not reveal her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had instructed her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai's bidding as she had done when she was under his tutelage. At that time, when Mordecai was sitting in the palace gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. Mordecai learned of this plot and told Queen Esther. And Esther reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. This matter was investigated and found to be so, and the two were impaled on stakes. This was recorded in the book of Annals in the instance of the king.
I didn't realize how early the staking started. A lot of impalation. Our next reader, please give it up for Denise Ellenberg. Miss Denise.
Chapter 3. Sometime afterwards, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He advanced him and seated him higher than any of his fellow officials. All the king's courtiers in the palace gate knelt and bowed low to Haman. For such was the king's order concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel or bow low. When the king's courtiers were in the palace gate, they said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" When they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to him, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail, for he had explained to him that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow low to him, Haman was filled with rage, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews. Mordecai's people throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, that is, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, Pur, which means the lot, was cast before Haman concerning that every day and every month until it fell on the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. And it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If you please, your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury." Thereupon, the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the foe of the Jews. And the king said, "The money and the people are yours to do as you see fit." On the 13th day of the first month, the king's scribes were summoned, and a decree was issued, as Haman directed to the king's satraps, to the governors of every province and to the officials of every people, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language. The orders were in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet. Accordingly, written instructions were dispatched by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. The text of the document was to the effect that a law should be proclaimed in every single province. It was to be publicly displayed to all the people so that they might be ready for that day. The couriers went out post-haste on the royal mission, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress Shushan. The king and Haman sat down to a feast, but the city of Shushan was dumbfounded.
Well, at least somebody was upset about it. Our next reader is another religious school teacher, Mr. Alex. Mr. Alex Mead, chapter 4.
All right. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went through the city crying out loudly and bitterly until he came in front of the palace gate, for one could not enter the palace gate wearing sackcloth. Also, in every province that the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and everybody lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. She sent clothing for Mordecai to wear so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he refused. Thereupon Esther summoned Hatak, one of the eunuchs whom the king had appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn the why and wherefore of it all. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the palace gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and all about the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him the written text of the law that had been proclaimed in Shushan for their destruction. He bade him show it to Esther and inform her, and charge her to go to the king and to appeal to him and to plead with him for her people. When Hatak came and delivered Mordecai's message to Esther, Esther told Hatak to take back to Mordecai the following reply: all the king's courtiers and the people of the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends the golden scepter to him may he live. Now I have not been summoned to visit the king for the last 30 days. When Mordecai was told that Esther had said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther: do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Then Esther sent back this answer to Mordecai: go assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it is contrary to the law. And if I am to perish, I shall perish. So Mordecai went about the city and did just as Esther had commanded him.
Ooh, folks, it is a dark moment for the Jews of Shushan. I think that we're going to break that up with a little song. We're going to take just a little music break. Fun fact, there are 2 holidays that we celebrate that are not in the Torah. Can anyone tell me what the one is other than Purim? Hanukkah! That is why you may notice some of the same songs being sung at both Hanukkah and at Purim, because they are very similar, where we have a foe that is a human being past Toraic times trying to kill us yet again. So we're going to sing. This is the English of Me Yimalel, because people are drinking wine. I thought maybe it was mean to do a whole Hebrew song right out of the gate. Here we go. Who can retell the things that befell us? Who can count them? In every age, a hero or sage came to our aid. One more time. Who can retell the things that befell us? Who can count them? In every age, a hero or sage came to our aid. Not to spoil the ending, but I think a hero is about to come to our aid. Miss Edna Riley, will you teach us about her?
On the 3rd day, Esther put on royal apparel. And stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's, where the king was sitting on his royal throne, the throne room facing the entrance of the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter which he had in his hand. And Esther approached and touched the tip of his scepter. "What troubles you, Queen Esther?" the king asked her. "And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be granted you." "If it please your majesty," Esther replied. "Yes. Let your majesty and Haman am I moving too much? Come today to the feast that I have prepared for him." The king commanded, "Tell Haman to hurry and do Esther's bidding." This is like...
You didn't know Purim was a comedy, did you?
Who says a good comedian can't laugh during their... Okay, this straighten up now, Queen Esther. Yes. "If it please your majesty," Esther replied, "let your majesty and Haman come Come today to the feast that I have prepared for him. The king commanded, tell Haman to hurry. Thank you. And do Esther's bidding. Oh, thank you. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. At the wine feast, the king asked Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. My wish, replied Esther. My request, if your majesty will do me the favor, if it please your majesty to grant my wish and accede to my request, let your majesty and Haman come to the feast which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do your majesty's bidding. Don't do that. That day, Haman went out happy and lighthearted. I'm coming back. I'm coming back. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the palace gate, and Mordecai did not even rise or even stir on his account, Haman was filled with rage. Nevertheless, Haman controlled himself and went home to see and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman told them about his great wealth and his many sons, and all about how the king had promoted him and advanced him above the officials and the king's courtiers. Courtiers? Yeah. What is more, said Haman, Queen Esther gave a feast, and besides the king, she did not have anyone but me. And tomorrow, too, I am invited by her along with the king. Oh, he thinks a lot of himself. Yet all this means nothing to me every time I see the Jew Mordecai. Yay. What? Yay. Yes, sitting at the palace gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a stake be put up 50 cubits high, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then you can go gaily with the king to the feast. The proposal pleased Haman. And he had the stake put up.
Wow, that's pretty harsh. Alice Lenz will let us know what happens next.
Thank you. That night, sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the annals, to be brought, and it was read to the king. There it was found written that Mordecai had denounced Bigthana and Tirshi, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had plotted to do away with the king's Ahasuerus. That what honor or advancement had been conferred on Mordecai? For this, the king inquired. Nothing at all had been done for him, replied the king's servant, who were in attendance on him. Who was in the court? The king asked. For Haman had just entered the outer court of the royal palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai impaled at the stake. He had prepared for him. It is Haman standing in the court. The king's servant answered him. Let him enter, said the king. Haman entered, and the king asked him, what should be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? And so Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let royal garb which the king had worn be brought, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and whose head a royal diadem had been set, and let the door and the horse be put in the charge of one of the king's noble counters, and let the man whom the king desires to honor be adorned and paraded on the horse through the city square, while they proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Quick then, said the king to Haman, get the garb and the horse, as you have said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. Omit nothing of all you have done, nothing they have proposed. So Haman took the garb and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square. And he proclaimed before him, this is what is done for the man who the king desires to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, while Haman hurried home, his head covered in mourning. There Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that has befallen him. He observed, and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. Then while they were still speaking, the king and his eunuchs arrived, hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared.
Ooh, thank you, Alice. Peter Pizer is up next to tell us what happens when that guy that we are not going to name gets to the feast.
Chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to a feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, the king again asked Esther at the wine feast, "What is your wish, Queen Esther?" "It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Queen Esther replied, "If your majesty will do me the favor, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted me as my wish, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Had we only been sold as bondmen and bondwomen, I would have kept silent, for the adversary is not worthy of the king's trouble." Thereupon King Ahasuerus demanded of Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who dared to do this?" "The adversary and enemy," replied Esther. "Is the evil Haman And Haman cringed in terror before the king and the queen. The king, in his fury, left the wine feast for the palace garden, while Haman remained to plead with Queen Esther for his life, for he saw that the king has resolved to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet room, Haman was lying prostrate on the couch with his hands over his face. Does he mean to ravish the queen in my palace? No sooner did these words leave the king's lips than Haman's face was covered. Then Harbonus, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "What is more at stake is standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, the man whose words saved the king. Impale him on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the stake which he put up for Mordecai, and the king's fury abated.
Thank you, Peter. Carol Duchak, our next. We are getting near the end. Carol, what is next up for the folks in Shushan?
Be ready for this first sentence. That very day, King Ahasuerus gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Mordecai presented himself to the king, for Esther had revealed how he was related to her. That was one sentence. The king slipped off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's property. Esther spoke to the king again, falling at his feet and weeping and beseeching him to avert the evil plotted by Haman, the Agagite, against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. "If it please your majesty," she said, "and if I have won your favor and the proposal seems right to your majesty, and if I am pleasing to you, let dispatches be written countermanding those which were written by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, embodying his plot to annihilate the Jews throughout the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster which will befall my people, and how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai, the Jew, "I have given Haman's property to Esther, and he has been impaled on the stake for scheming against the Jews. And you may further write with regard to the Jews as you see fit. Write it in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet. For an edict that has been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet may not be revoked." So the king's scribes were summoned at that time on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, and letters were written at Mordecai's dictation to the Jews and to the satraps, the governors, and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. He had them written in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed with the king's signet. Letters were dispatched by mounted couriers riding steeds used in the king's service, bred of the royal stud. To this effect, the king has permitted the Jews of every city to assemble and fight for their lives. If any people or province attacks them, they may destroy, massacre, and exterminate its armed force together with women and children and plunder their possessions. On a single day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. The text of the document was to be issued as a law in every single province. It was to be publicly displayed to all the peoples, so that the Jews should be ready for that day to avenge themselves of their enemies. The couriers, mounted on royal steeds, went out in urgent haste at the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress Shushan. Mordecai left the king's presence in royal robes of blue and white, with a magnificent crown of gold and a mantle of fine linen and purple wool, and the city of Shushan rang with joyous cries. The Jews enjoyed light and gladness, happiness and honor. We don't have any more names to give you. And every province and in every city, when the king's command and decree arrived, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday, and many of the people of the land professed to be Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. That's one way to recruit Jews.
Yeah, imagine that, a world in which people say that they're Jews to be safe. All right, we have 2 more chapters. We're going to take a little song break and then get through them very quickly. This has a little bit, I'm going to ask you to stand up. We're going to get a little stretch. This is our 8th inning stretch. Very simple actions. The words, Mishe nichnas adar marbin b'simcha, that's it. And we're going to go Mishe, 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 right back and forth. And we're going to go, Ay, Mishe nichnas adar marbin b'simcha. Very simple. All right, are we ready? 2, 3, 4. Mishe, 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 Niknas Adar. You got it. Mishe, 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 Niknas Adar. Ay, Mishe, Niknas Adar. Marbin besimcha. Mishe, 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 Niknas Adar. Woo! Mishe, 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 Niknas Adar. Ay, Mishe, Niknas Adar. Marbin besimcha. Mishe, Niknas Adar. Marbin besimcha. Excellent. All right. You may be seated. And so, I'm going to read this one because it's the longest one, and I don't want to be here that long, so I'm just going to do it. On the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, when the kings commanded the decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened, and the Jews got their enemies in their power. Now, this is the part of the story that we like to gloss over because it's not very nice, doesn't make the Jews look very good, and that's what I'm going to do is just summarize it for you. The king gave permission for the Jews to take the offensive for 2 days, and they did, and they were very successful. And then they also impaled Haman's 10 sons. Lots of impaling. I know, I said I would be fast, but this is an adult story. Lots of scepters and tips and impaling, I'm just saying. So we did all that. We killed a bunch of people, and then the king said, give all my power to Mordecai and Esther, and they did. And Esther and Mordecai said that we had to celebrate this every year and be happy on the 14th of Adar. So we did, and we are. And these days of Purim shall be observed at their proper time, as Mordecai, the Jew, and now Queen Esther, has obligated them to do, and just as they have assumed for themselves and their descendants the obligation of the fasts with their lamentations. And Esther's ordinance validating these observances of Purim was recorded in a scroll, and I am very delighted to tell you our last chapter, which is only 3 verses, is actually going to be chanted from the scroll by Michelle. Now, I don't know how many of you know this. This is cool as snot. We have an actual scroll.
It's adorable.
This is the Megillah of Esther. It is an actual scroll. We are going to hear the last 3 chapters of this story chanted in the actual trope by our friend. Oh, I forgot to look up the English. It's fine.
They'll figure it out. There's also names in here too, so don't put those. Well, the groggers are done. I'll just give you
Yes,
that.
it's okay.
You'll hear it. It'll be good. Okay.
Let me hold that
Thank
up for
you. Vayasem hamelech Achashverosh mas al haaretz ve'yeh hayam v'chol ma'aseh takvo ukvurato ufarashat gedulat Mordechai asher gidlo hamelech Elohim ketuvim al sefer divrei hayamim lemalchei madai ufaras ki Mordechai hayehudi mishne lamelech achashverosh vegadol layehudim veratzui lerov echav doresh tov le'amo v'dover shalom lechol zaro.
And the closing blessings, my friend. Take us home.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam harav et rivenu v'hadan et dinenu v'hanifra lanu mikol tzarenu Baruch atah Adonai ha'el HaMoshiach.
All right, we have one more piece of business to do before we can go eat hot dogs and play games. If you are participating in the costume contest, please come to the front. We are going to give you your numbers. If you are over 12 on that side, what side? We didn't talk about the game. Just if you want to be in the costume contest, come up and we will give you numbers. Miss Menehelet Morgan has numbers for you. Numbers and letters. Miss Jess has the letters for the grown-up side. So these folks are going to keep their numbers on right now, and as they're wandering around, one ticket is one vote. And we're going to go ahead. Hava Megillah. 2, 3, 4. All right, everybody, take a look. The voting cups are just outside the sanctuary. The old people are in letters, the young people are in numbers. All right. We're going to have our parade now. Are we ready? Follow me. You ready? We're parading our costumes. Follow me, everyone. Keep your numbers on so people can see them and vote for you. And go have a hot dog. We have both veggie and meaty.